Hello, everybody. This is my pleasure to open today's seminar dedicated to Sobornost in the Orthodox theology. But let me just start with a couple of words about our project. My name is Irina Paert, and I'm coordinating a research project based at the School of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Tartu. So this project is entitled Orthodoxy as Solidarity, an examination of popular and conciliar orthodoxy in Estonia during the long 20th century. So one of the aims of this project and of these seminars is to focus on the themes of conciliarity, synodality, catholicity in the Orthodox Church. And we would like to address the concept of Sobornost, which remains to be very little understood, not just by general public, but also by the academic community. And today's seminar will be called Sobornost in the Orthodox Theology. Originally, we planned it to focus on the 20th century, but I think we need to have a broader view. And I would like to introduce my co-host of these seminars, Andrey Shishkov, who is the member of the Tartu project. And Andrey is a theologian, so he is the director of the NGO Center for Advanced Theological Studies in Moscow, and he has written extensively on contemporary ecclesiology and political theology. So, Andrey, I would like to give now the microphone to you, and you will introduce our today's speaker.
Thank you, Irina. I'm glad to introduce our speaker, Father Andrew Louth, who is a priest of the Suresh Diocese of the Russian Orthodox Church and an emeritus professor of patristics and Byzantine Studies in the Department of Theology and Religion of Durham University, and an honorary fellow of the Faculty of Theology of Free University in Amsterdam. We know Father Andrew as an author of books and articles in theology and Christian church history, especially in patristics and modern Orthodox theology. Among the characters of his books are Denis the Areopagite, Maximus the Confessor, John of Damascus, as such as modern theologians. And his book of 2015 is called Modern Orthodox Thinkers from Philokalia to Present Days. Here, this book. Now, Father Andrew is an editor of the Oxford Dictionary of Christian Church and an editor of the new translation of Philokalia. Today, Father Andrew will speak about Sobornost, the notion of Sobornost in the Orthodox theology of the 20th century. And I believe we will see the adventures of this notion in contemporary Orthodox thought. I'm sure that we will have many questions, so let's not delay and move on to the Father Andrew's report. Please, Father Andrew.
Thank you very much, Andrey. And even though this is I think this is a rather pitiful offering, I would actually like to give it in memory of two people who died recently, whose works, both of whom wrote on what we're talking about. Robert Bird, who died earlier this year, and Sergei Haruji, who died very recently. I knew both of them to some degree, and I'd like to sort of offer this as such as it is to them. I started off by looking at the notion of Sobornost, by reflecting on the word itself. Because one of the confusions that can emerge almost immediately is that it's often described, its etymology is given in various different ways. The way in which Homyakov introduces it, though, and though Robert Bird's book on spiritual unity asserts firmly on the second page that he didn't use the word Sobornost. There is in fact an article in the just come out Sobornost for last year, an article by Alison Kolosova, which demonstrates that indeed Khomyakov did use the word Sobornost, though he didn't use it in the little treatise on the unity of the church. So let's start from that. The adjective Soborny, or Sobornaya, because it's feminine, occurs in the Slavonic, the normal Slavonic translation of the article on the Creed in the Nicene Creed, article on the Church in the Nicene Creed. The Greek is is mian, agian, katholikin, ke apostolikin ecclesia, and this comes out in Slavonic as, I hope it does at any rate, Vojedinu Sviatuju, Sobornuju, I apostolciu Tjekov. So the word Catholikin has not, as in the Western languages, has not just been sort of taken over and adopted as a word itself, as in, I say, in all Western languages, the word Catholikin is translated Catholic or Catholic or Katholisch or whatever. It has been translated. My suspicion is, but it's only a suspicion, is that it's been translated by some rather learned translator from Greek into Slavonic, who wanted to represent what the word meant rather than just simply transliterating it. And he took Catholikin to be related to the Greek word katholon, which means universal, and therefore translated it Soborny, because for him this meant gathering everything together into a universal whole. There is, I believe, though I'm not an expert on any of this, there is, I believe, evidence that early Slavonic manuscripts actually had Catholicescu, a calque of Catholicos, but certainly by the modern period, the normal word is Sobornuju. And there's no particular reason to suppose that it ever went back to Cyril and Methodius. That's one way of looking at it, and it's the way I think in which Khomyakov approaches it. But very often one is told other things. Soborny is sometimes translated as conciliar, which assumes that it is derived from the Russian Slavonic word sobor. But the Russian word sobor can actually translate, as far as I can see, translate any one of three different Greek words. One word is katholikon, which is the Greek word for a church that is public rather than a private chapel or paraclesion. And so every town and village will have at least one katholikon. A monastery will have a katholikon as opposed to the chapels that it has. And that word is translated on the basis, with presumably the same justification as Soborny translating Catholiki as Sobor. But Sobor itself can translate two other different words in Greek. It is the normal translation for the word synodos in Greek, which means a synod or a council. And it is also, as I verified this morning myself, in a little reprint I have of an 18th century dictionary between Greek and Slavonic, it is also used to translate synaxis, which is an alternative word in Greek for the Eucharist. For both synodos and synaxis suggest either a meeting of ways, as in synodos, or a meeting of people, as in synaxis. And so it could be described as in some form of a meeting. So there are three sort of resonances to the word sobor in Slavonic and in Russian. And these sometimes are appealed to. I still seems to me to be most likely that the use of the word soborny and sobornost originated with people like Chomyakov, and it's connected with the translation of the Creed. Now, this means that soborny in Russian can hold together three different ideas, quite apart from its use in the Creed. It can mean it has a kind of, if you like, a very generally churchy meaning. It means a church or it means a council, but it also specifically could be used for the Eucharist. I don't know if this is common, but certainly this 18th century dictionary thought that Siaxis would be rendered sobor in Slavonic. I'll come back to that. I'm not going to develop that now. I'll come back to that later. But I think there's something worth noting here before we go any further. Robert Byrd, of blessed memory, in the introduction to his book on spiritual unity, a Slavophile reader, says the Slavophile's thought is all about sobornost and integral knowledge. These concepts stand both at the beginning and at the end of their writings, at the source and the delta of this intellectual journey. And though, as I've said, according to Byrd, the abstract nouns, sobornost and teleoznania, are not actually found in the writings of Chomyakov and Kireevsky, which apparently is not true. These terms have become characteristic of the developments in Slavophile thought in the 19th century. Now, the Slavophile, we all know this, but I have to just repeat it. The Slavophiles were seeking to find what it really meant to be Slav or Russian, partly in reaction against the westernization of Russian society introduced by Peter the Great and continued by Catherine the Great, and partly also as a way of defining who they were over against the West, the rest of Western thought. But as everybody points out, they in fact are deeply indebted to 19th century Western thought, and their sense of their exclusivity is not really to be taken terribly seriously. They're deeply indebted to German idealism, and both these key terms that Robert Byrd mentioned, sobornost and synodality, both have roots and resonances within German idealism. They're both terms that want to introduce an understand, a sense of what it is to know that runs against what was perceived as the prevailing trend towards individualism and a knowledge which is really a form of accurate information. And they're not alone in this. There is a whole tradition, a kind of counter-tradition from the 17th century onwards in the intellectual history of the West, often thought of as esoteric, and one mentions names in this context like Burma, that resisted the breakdown of knowledge into the separate compartments that was part and parcel of the development of a scientific understanding of the world. And they felt that in separating everything up into these different departments, these different scientific notions, that in achieving this pigeonholing, I suppose, a great deal was lost, and in particular, any sense of link or links or connections between different ideas in different contexts. And the German idealists pick up a good deal of this, and ideas like how the one relates to the many are very important to them. the idea that there is some ultimate idea of the Pancake hen. These are ideas that fit in very easily to notions of Sobornost, which, even if it means universality, it means universality in a kind of active way. It's about gathering everything together. It's not just about it's not an abstract universal. And the other thing that it seems to me that the Slavophiles share with many other people in Europe is what Andrey Valitsky, in one of his books on the Slavophiles, calls a conservative romanticism, a sense that many people had in the 19th century, that the world, the familiar world of organic communities where people belonged and found their identity, that this world was slipping away, and that something was being lost. And it is, anyone who knows much about Western thought will immediately have names that will call to mind that seem to have something of the same concerns of Chomyakov. I mean, two that I've just put down here, just jotted down. Coleridge, who seems to me to have many of the concerns of Chomyakov. And these concerns are rooted in a sort of nostalgia for a village-based community where people belonged and knew where they belonged and found their identity in belonging. And also Tocqueville, who also, in a rather different way, has this same sense of nostalgia for a past where things fitted together properly. And this leads to ways of trying to conceive knowledge as, first of all, unifying. It's something that draws things together, that it's not a narrow, it's not a narrow perception of something particular, but knowledge is something that joins things together so that we have a sense of where we are in the world in which we belong. Knowledge also as participatory, that knowledge is not just a matter of registering the truth, but in some way of participating in the truth. And the third element, it seems to me, but there are probably lots more elements, is the way in which knowledge can be understood as expressing the wisdom of a community rather than the genius of an individual. And these are all ideas that seem to me that lie behind why Sobornost became, first of all, important to the 19th century Slavophile thinkers and some of their followers, and also became attractive in the 20th century. Now, Chomyakov introduces the notion of Sobornost, or the Soborny character of the church, in relation to the church. I mean, that's explicitly what he's thinking about, it seems to me. And it is always in a puzzle as to what exactly he means by it. And I think this is a puzzle that on the one hand goes back a long way, and it's a puzzle that in some ways is intrinsic. Because the weakness, but also the strength of Chomyakov's concept lies in a vagueness, which is a consequence of its primarily negative connotations. Sobornost in relation to the church is pitted against Roman Catholicism on the one hand and Protestantism on the other. Whereas Catholicism, to Chomyakov's eyes, achieves unity at the expense of freedom, at the expense of suppressing freedom, Protestantism, on the other hand, sacrifices unity for the sake of freedom. Whereas Sobornost, according to Chomyakov, holds together unity and freedom in the organic unity of a community in which its members find their meaning and their freedom. There are all sorts of philosophical ideas lurking behind this, and in particular, an idea that is very commonplace in discussions of 19th century Russian literature in particular, of the contrast between the individual, cut off from everybody, and the person who, in some sense, finds his meaning in relation to community. An idea which was, well, let's say, it was all the rage in the 1920s when the Russian emigres from Lenin's Russia found themselves in the West, and in particular in Paris. I mean, forms of personalism that make a contrast between an isolated individual and a person as someone who belongs to a community and is formed by a community, fashioned by a community. That was all the rage in the 20s and 30s. And the Russians found themselves, I suppose, found themselves speaking a language which they found surprisingly easy to understand. There's another problem though about all this, and that is that Sobornost derives from a word that has been used to replace Catholic. And I think there is a tendency for Sobornost to be used instead of the word Catholic because of the associations of the word Catholic. And this can have the danger, it seems to me, of abandoning the word Catholic to the Roman Catholics, the Papal Church, and accepting their understanding of the way in which the Catholic came to understand, the way in which the word Catholic came to be understood as characterizing particularly communion with the Pope. There's not, I don't know much work has been done on this, but the little work that I have managed to explore suggests that this was not a very obvious process, and that it was a process that that moved by, it lurched forward from one idea to another, picked up by Augustine in particular to use against the Donatists, and then, and because that, what defined the Catholics of North Africa, as he called them, against the Donatists, was their attachment to the papacy, paved the way for a use of Catholic, which in some languages in the West simply means Roman Catholic. The other danger of this, it seems to me, to put it in another vein, is that to allow the word Catholic to come to designate a part of the divided church seems to me to allow a note of the church alongside unity, holiness, and apostolicity to lapse into denominationalism. And I think it's something that, in the end, I think we cannot. To allow that to happen is to distort what was understood by the church and the creed that we all hold as the ecumenical creed. The word ecumenical, I think, also is part of this attempt to avoid what should be the real way of describing a church universal in its possession of the truth. To describe such a church as Catholic, ecumenical was used in order to avoid using the dangerous word Catholic, and it has. I may exaggerate, but I think that it has a tendency to draw attention away from the center of things and focus on what originally simply meant was simply an overweening designation of the extent of the Roman Empire, the inhabited world, the oikumene. But the biggest problem is that negatively conceived, Khomyakov struggles to state positively what it is that Sobornost means. And since Khomyakov's time, it seems to me that, since Khomyakov's time, it seems to me the problem has been complicated in another way. With the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the spawning of autocephalous churches, it seems to me that the notion of Sobornost is too weak a notion to express, it's both too weak a notion to express what it is that expresses the unity of the Orthodox churches. But because it's a weak notion, it can be used and be interpreted in more or less any way you like. And it seems to me now, I think, with the schism between Moscow and Constantinople, it seems to me that sorry, let me go back and say it. It's trouble reading my writing, but never mind. The new schism between the two most important patriarchates, Constantinople and Moscow, prominent for very, very different reasons. That with this, the ecclesiastical notion of Sobornost is beginning to look more than a little threadbare. I mean, there are, of course, passages particularly on the Church's One, very beautiful passages that gesture after something of what Sobornost might mean. And particularly towards the end, he has a paean of praise for the way in which, in everything the Church does, the individual and the whole community is involved, and in particular in prayer. That the prayer is held together by the mutual prayer of everybody within the Church. And this prayer links with the prayers of the Mother of God and the saints and the angels. And that, so in a kind of way, the Church could be understood as being bound together by the sinews of prayer, an idea which I find profoundly compelling. Now, it's not going to go on much longer, but Irina did mention two things that I'd forgotten about. And this is, in the English-speaking world, well, a bit of the English-speaking world, the word Sobornost has become very well known. And from that being well known, it's become a significant notion in ecumenical matters, both at the World Council of Churches and in conversations between different churches. The journal that I edit is the Journal of the Fellowship of Sobornost and Sergius, a society that was founded about 90 years ago, and really grew out of the encounter that took place in Paris and then in London between Russian Orthodox emigres and welcoming Western Christians, which struck a particularly strong chord with the Anglicans. This led to the foundation of the Fellowship of St. Albans and Sergius, named after the protomartyr of England and the greatest saint of Russia. And its journal, not from the very beginning, from the beginning the journal was called the Journal of the Fellowship of St. Albans and Sergius, but that became a mouthful, and very quickly, I've got, I think 1936, I was just looking it up and forgotten. It was called Sobornost, spelt both in English and in Slavonic on the front page of the journal, and Sobornost had a prime representing the soft sign at the end of Sobornost, which continued on in the journal until 1976, when, for a reason which I have not been able to discover, it was dropped, and it's just now Sobornost without a prime, without a soft sign. Now, I think in some ways, the very vagueness of Sobornost and the idea of Sobornost as representing a middle way between a too restrictive Catholicism, too authoritarian Catholicism, and a too disunited Protestantism, represented an Anglican perception of themselves. The idea of the Church of England as a middle way between the gaudiness of Rome and the bareness of Protestantism goes back at least until, well, it goes back to decades after the Reformation. You find it both in Jewell and also in George Herbert, who wrote poems that describe the nature of the modest Anglican Church as opposed to the gaudy Roman Church and threadbare Protestant church. And I think and also, it's worth mentioning that the Church's One was written by Chomiakov for an Englishman, William Palmer, and he knew English. He knew the English quite well, and I think it's not beyond suspicion that Chomiakov wrote the way he did because he knew this was what William Palmer wanted to hear, and not just William Palmer, but other Anglicans too. So there is a sense in which Sobornost presented itself to the Anglicans as a wonderfully Russian way of describing what they thought they believed. And for a long time, Anglican Orthodox relationships were very strong, leading from time to time to recognition of Anglican orders by one or other of the Orthodox churches, Romania in the 30s, for instance. And Sobornost itself originally was very much an ecumenical journal, opening the world of Anglicanism to the Russians and the world of Orthodoxy to the Anglicans. The only other thing I'd add, because I was actually talking about modern discussions, Sobornost, as Chomiakov uses it, has really got no Eucharistic overtones, as far as I can see. He's talking about the nature of the church and the way in which within the church there is this reconciliation of unity and manifoldness. It's a basically philosophical idea that fits an ideal of what he thinks the Orthodox Church is, as opposed to the exaggerations on the one side of Catholicism, on the other side of Protestantism. I can't remember what I was going to say now. And it seems to me that yes, sorry, that's all. He has no reference at all that I've ever come across in any of his writings that links Sobornost with the Eucharist, which you might have thought might be natural, well, certainly might have been natural, given that the word Sobor is the Russian equivalent, the Slav equivalent of synaxis, which is in Greek usage a very common word to describe the coming together of the community in the Eucharist. In modern, particularly Greek ecumenical debate, the word Sobornost has been picked up and made something of, and particularly by Metropolitan John Zizioulas. But for him, it is primarily a Eucharistic notion. It is a way of describing the nature of the community that gathers together in unity under the bishop for the celebration of the Eucharist. And I think it's worth mentioning that the word Sobornost has, in an ecumenical context, particularly because of the influence of Metropolitan John, it has acquired sacramental overtones that don't seem to be particularly prominent in the 19th century use of it. There I'll end. I've gone for more than 20 minutes. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Father Andrew, for an interesting and informative report. And let's move on the discussion. First question from Thomas Bremer. Please, Thomas. Okay. It was applause. Okay. Does anyone have questions already? Or while you thinking, then to start a discussion, I'll ask a question. This specific concept of sobornost appeared in the Russian theological tradition, and here sobornost is understood as an organic unity of the church sealed by divine grace. This concept appeared under the influence of the Romantic tradition in theological and philosophical thought. Does modern Greek theology have an analog of the concept of sobornost connected with Romanticism? or it remains a specific concept of the Russian tradition? Is it a synexis or a koinonia or something else?
That's an interesting question. I never thought about it. It's very interesting, and I think there's two things that come to mind. First of all, in the heyday of Romanticism, the Greeks weren't thinking theologically; they were fighting for independence, and even when they got independence, things were not very settled. The university faculties belonged to the very end of the 19th century, for instance. So I don't think there is much of a romantic influence on Greek theological thought, though there is quite, surprisingly, there is a lot of influence of Greek romantic, of Western romantic thought on Greek, particularly Greek poetry. I mean, people like Dionysius Solomos and Calvos, Andreas Calvos, the two first modern Greek poets, as it were. These are both people who you would naturally categorize as romantics, who see poetry in that sort of light. But neither of these had any particular theological leanings, as far as I know. On the other hand, what is, in my view, the most lively theological journal in Greece today is called Synaxi, gathering together, with the overtones of the Eucharist. And I think that behind the ideas of Synaxi lie ideas of what it is to know, that see this as something which is something that belongs to, something that happens within the community. It's not the individual making his own little way, but it's something that is revealed in a community, and in particular revealed when that community is gathered together to celebrate the Eucharist. Ideas. I mean, the most influential thinker, I think, Greek thinker who thinks in these terms, and who was a founding member of the journal that went before Synaxi, called Synora, which means a boundary, or a boundary in the sense that it's got two sides to it, not a barrier. Is Christos Yanaras, and Christos Yanaras has now for 5 decades been exploring what it means for knowledge to be personal, to grow out of the experience of community, and so on. And so there, I think you do find, I think you could say that you find a picking up of a notion of Sobornost in a way was certainly inspired by the Russian theologians in Paris, though he arrived there too late to know Losky, who was the person who particularly fired him in the 60s.
Thank you. Any question? Alison Kolosova, please.
I just, first of all, I wanted to make a comment about what Father Andrew said at the beginning about my article, which talks about the use of Sobornost in Khomyakov's writings. I just wanted to point out that, in fact, the word Sobornost is used in the first Russian translation of Khomyakov's writings, that he actually wrote his theological tracts in French. So it really is the Russian translation that does first contain the word Sobornost. And I'd just like to mention a very good article by Basil Laurier, which is about this issue. And he compares the French and, well, the 3 passages. There are 3 passages where the word Sobornost is actually used in that first translation. And he gives a very good comparison of the French version and this Russian version, pointing out what it means in each case. And I mean, that's another issue that I won't go into now, but I just wanted to kind of clarify that point. The other thing, my question really is related to what Father Andrew, you said about the spawning of autocephalous churches. And I think you said that Sobornost is too weak a notion to express what these kind of autocephalous churches need. And I mean, could you say, you know, what you think, what notion do they need? If Sobornost is too weak, I mean, is it the notion of catholicity, or is it something completely different? Or perhaps I didn't quite understand what you were saying at that point. I mean, is it conciliarity? I mean, yeah. Anyway, sorry. Yes, sorry to interrupt.
Oh, it's probably just my being a bit fed up with Orthodoxy now, but it does seem to me that the spawning of separate autocephalous churches has led many of them to adopt a very, I don't know how to put it, I want to say nationalist, but that goes too far. To adopt a very, yeah, it is to adopt an understanding of who they are as Orthodox that relates very, very, very much to their own tradition. Even with people like the Serbian theologian, Justin Popovic, even with him, his intellectual links with Russia are very profound. I mean, he sounds as if he's coming out of the rather more conservative elements in the diaspora. And he was, of course, in some ways a pupil of Metronome Antony Krapovitsky. But apart from that, which is background, when he begins to talk about the Serbian church and its challenges and its destiny, it is in terms of what he calls Sviatoslavism, St. Savaism. It's peculiarly Serbian, and I don't know any other churches where this is quite so strong, but I think it is present in some ways with the Romanians. It's very, very strongly present with the Greeks, though it takes the rather with the Greeks it takes a form. How can I put it? Well, the Greeks basically think that the Orthodox ought to be Greek. And if you look at the calendar, it looks like that. They acknowledge, they celebrate very, very few Christians that are not Greeks. The Greeks are the only people, the only church, Orthodox church I know, that doesn't use the Sunday after All Saints' Day as the Sunday of all the saints of Russia, all the saints of Romania, all the saints of Serbia. No, just the new martyrs, because before that they were all Greek. Is almost the impression they give. I think that Sobornost just isn't, because it's not very clear what it means, and it doesn't, and because its associations are very 19th century and very much connected with a sort of conservative nostalgia from a world that they knew was passing. I just don't think it has any. It hasn't got any natural residue of meaning that is enough to cling on to. I think it's an alternative for words that are much stronger, but we don't seem to want to have the strength of them. And if you use catholicity instead of Sobornost, then that would have overtones of. It would have overtones of being called by a truth that is universal. And sort of living in the truth. The word Catholic must have something to do with the truth, whereas Sobornost doesn't seem to me to have that. It's to do with gathering things together, but quite what it's gathering together is left very much in the open, I think. mean, I could speak on the other side, but but my predominant feeling is that Sobornost is a notion that has been useful because it is vague, and that we need something that is useful because it says something, really.
Thank you, Father Andrew, for your answer. Paul, please, your question.
Am I unmuted now?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. Father Andrew, thank you very much. And somewhat Father John Mindorf makes a similar observation about Sobornost as attractive but too vague to solve real problems. But what I would ask you about, is if you raise, as you have, the issue of what does Sobornost bring together. Sobornost, in the sense of conciliarity, is a formula for bringing communities together. Communities that have either fallen apart or that recognize each other but need to gather together to reaffirm their fellowship. What would you say about the potency of the concept of Sobornost in the sense of conciliarity?
Yeah. It's about a process. I mean, it's about a way of resolving problems, and I think it is very important to say that the way we resolve problems is not by looking for someone to tell us what to do. That we come together as Christians, we share our ideas, and that all that bit of the encyclical from Crete is saying something that's very important. So the synodality, as I think is what it calls it in the Cretan statement, that synodality, coming together in synod, is something that characterizes the church from the parish right to the universal church, and that and it provides the opportunity for us to listen to one another and together, under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, to find out where we are. What is important about the truth that we hold in the context in which we live. The trouble with talking about it now, 5 years, 6 years after the Council of Crete, is the Council of Crete wasn't. There are all sorts of problems, it seems to me, with the Council of Crete. We didn't say anything very much for a start. And the best people have been able to say about the Council of Crete is that it was a miracle that it happened. I mean, I get very little more than that from anybody. So that the other thing that really causes anxiety about the Council of Crete is that when it talks about synodality and when it gives examples of the continuing synodal being of the church, they're all Greek pretty well. It's as if the Russians didn't have any synods, or the Romanians, or the Serbs. I mean, it creates an impression of a single synodal reality, which is that of the ecumenical patriarch. And that it seems to me somebody must have thought that was what they were doing, and wondered whether that really was the thing to do. I mean, it can't be that it can't be they knew that the Russians weren't coming, and so they weren't going to say anything about them, because these documents are drawn up before the council, before the synod. These documents were drawn up, and they ignored not just the Russians, but the Romanians and the Serbs. And I think that this is this suggests that synodality is a notion that needs to be thought through a good deal more clearly and thought through in a way that embraces the fact, because it is a fact, that the church in the first centuries didn't think of itself as being led by just one super bishop, as it were. That there was at least there was a pentarchy to start off with. Well, not to start off with, it took a long time to develop. But once it develops as a pentarchy. It doesn't develop as some sort of episcopal monarchy. And that should be recognised in the statements of Crete in the way that they aren't. I think that, I mean, apart from the ordinary disappointment of nothing happening and nothing being said and anything controversial being taken off the agenda, apart from that, it just seems to me that the theological thought that went behind drawing out the notion of synodality, of which Crete was an expression, very one-sided.
Thank you, Father Andrew. Indeed, it is funny that the Orthodox often call the Church as conciliar and the Roman Catholic as monarchical or papal, but in reality the opposite is true. Any questions?
And what it looks like we're running in the direction of a dual monarchy, basically, in the Orthodox Church, which is not a very helpful way of proceeding.
Irina, do you have any questions? Thomas Bremer, please.
Yeah, thank you. Just maybe a little bit a provocative question or a comment, but it came to my mind. Thank you very much for your presentation and for sorting out so clearly the etymological roots of the word and the significance and so on. And we understood and we knew earlier that we have the aspects of catholicity and of synodality, conciliarity, synodality. And my question is, when we take, because as far as I see, for example, the Russian theology, Russian dogmatical theology nowadays, and also in earlier times, when they discuss ecclesiology, they use the word katholichnos, so the catholicity. They speak also about Sobornost, but they have as we do in Western, I'm Roman Catholic, as in Western theology, we discuss the catholicity of the church as one of the marks and so on. And we have conciliarity with all problems just mentioned before. So my question, I confess it's a little bit provocative, what would we lose if we would not use the word Sobornost anymore? If we would limit ourselves to catholicity, we know what it means somehow, or we can reflect upon it, and conciliarity, we have to look how it works in different churches and how we can get it and so on. But what is the additional value we get from Sobornost? You said, I completely agree with you, you said it's a term which is a little bit blurry and which is not very clear, and people use it in different times in different ways, and they use it for underlining or for arguing for things and so on. But so my question is, what does it additionally bring?
Can't think really, I'm afraid. All I would say, but it's something that needs to be sort of excavated to get it, as it were. All I think I would say is that Sobornost is not Catholicity and conciliarity draw attention to aspects of the third note of the creed. Catholicity, I think, and as I understand it, Catholicity, and I think as the tradition has understood it, Catholicity is derived from the fact that the truth is one and that all Christians accept this one truth. And so it's not just the universal church everywhere. It's universal because the truth that is declared in the church is the one truth, which is Christ. So that conciliarity, as I sort of briefly suggested, conciliarity is one aspect, one of the ways, which I think should be very I think should be taken in a, should be applied in many different contexts. One of the ways in which we come to know the truth is not by having bright theologians having brilliant ideas that stun everybody, but by we come to know the truth by basically by praying together. And that is, I think, what conciliarity means. And I suppose, actually, having got into this, I think I perhaps would want to say that what Sobornost is, what Sobornost underlines is the, if you like, the non-institutional element of conciliarity. Conciliarity is usually understood in simply in institutional terms. You know, there is a parish council, there is a diocesan synod, there is, you know, there is a provincial synod, there's a synod of the patriarchate. These are institutions, and they're understood in that way. The regulations about synods in the canons are to do with how often they meet and who calls them, and that kind of thing. I think I would say that that's all very well, but there is the danger, I think, when talking about synodality or conciliarity, of forgetting that this only makes sense if it grows out of a praying community. That the institution on its own isn't enough. Truth on its own isn't enough. We have to participate in it. And that Sobornost may be, I mean, it's the best bits of Homiakov, the bits that, you know, where you feel, yeah, this is something important. When he talks about the way in which the church, the way in which we belong to the church because we pray with the church and are prayed for by the church. That bit, chapter 38, I think it is. Perhaps there, something like that. I mean, it seems very easy in ecclesiology to as in any sort of subject that we talked about another, to formulate concepts which are what it is we're, you know, which we can then sort of talk about and explain and clarify. But there's something more than that, and I think that the attraction of Sobornost in the middle of the last century has something to do with the fact that it talked about people coming together and praying together. One of the things about the fellowship conferences still is that they're based on a round of prayer. People get together and they pray together. There are Anglican Eucharists, Catholic Eucharists, Orthodox liturgies, and other services, which we all participate in. And I think that is a dimension that perhaps is covered by Sobornost. It seems to me that's the only bit, really, that I find, honestly, in Homiakov, where I'm not saying, no, it's a very important notion because it represents Homiakov's dismay at the collapse of the centuries-old system, as he thought it, the centuries-old system of the domain, the village, the serfs, of course, in Homiakov's day, and what I think Berjaev called, I had it somewhere written down here somewhere. Berjaev called oh, it's on the wrong. Ah, you see, that's what he called rural landlordly freedom. Well, it's as it sounds, it's a hopeless notion, but it does tell you where it's all coming from.
Thank you, Father Andrew, and thank you for your question, Thomas. I think that it is not a provocative, but a crucial question to understanding of the notion of Sobornost. And following Father Andrew, I would like to comment that there is two understanding of Sobornost as I understand in the 20th century, which we can describe as a radical metaphysics of radical collectivity in Khomyakov's or sense or in Afanasyev sense. This one part, and this collectivity in which everything is subordinated to a single divine will, and the dark side of this collectivity, the human individuality is lost. But the second understanding of Sobornost in Berdyayev's sense, it is a metaphysics of radical freedom, opposed to any form of objectification. And I think these two meanings of Sobornost, which we can find in Orthodox theology in the 20th century, quite different to conciliarity and to catholicity. Is something additional to them, in my view. And maybe we can think in this way to understand why we need it. Yeah, thank you. Any questions else? Irina, and then Paul.
I just wanted to continue or comment on what Father Andrew and Paul and Thomas were saying. So I think when we speak of conciliarity, so there is often the element of law, of councils and conciliarity as aiming at providing us, with this guidance in form of church law. And I think when Father Andrew emphasized this aspect of praying together, so this is a different kind of conciliarity. It's conciliarity of people being conciliar in prayer, not just in adopting new church laws or confirming old. So it's about the search for truth, but the search for truth in prayer. And I think that is very much reflected in your book, Father Andrew, where you, modern Orthodox thinkers, when you point out that there are two sources that influence the 20th century theology. One is this trend, coming from Slavophiles, by Khomyakov, and another is from Philokalia. So this the prayer, and I think Philokalia is often regarded as kind of not being sufficiently ecclesial. So while putting these two together, you kind of show that both are important, but that's just something which I've been thinking while listening to you.
I think that's very true. I think it's very important.
I think Paul wanted to ask some.
Thank you. Andrey Shishkov, your observation was helpful that in response to Father Andrew's exposition of Sobornost, that you have a Khomyakovian Sobornost emphasizing an organic conservatism. You have Berdyayev's Sobornost, an ideal of radical freedom. If I could lengthen the list, one thing we haven't talked about yet is Sobornost as a formula for church reform. In the late 19th and early 20th century in Russia, that was its primary weight. Sobornost became the watchword of the church reform movement that, of course, culminated in the Great Council of 1917-18. So I think it's, we may, as we continue our discussion and assessment here, want to keep that in mind, which actually runs in a very different direction from the Khomyakovian emphasis on organic community, a nostalgic appraisal of the present and so forth. I just wanted to interject that dimension into our ongoing assessment.
Thank you. I think, Paul, we are looking forward to your presentation on this topic, on the impact of Sobornost on this movement for church reform. So I wonder if there are any more questions to Father Andrew, or comments, or any thoughts.
Can I ask Paul to clarify something in his comment? Could we say that this third version of Sobornost, it is Sobornost as democratization?
That's a vexed question. I have something to say about it. I'd prefer not to say it right now. I've written about it. I think the notion that Sobornost in the reformist sense has to do with the democratization of the church, which then raises all kinds of vexing issues. That has become rather commonplace in the critique of Sobornost discourse. But I think most of that critique is misdirected. But that developing that point maybe takes us away from our focus of today. With your permission, I do have another question for Father Andrew. Father Andrew, say again in your very interesting response to Thomas Bremer's question of why, do we still need to retain this term, Sobornost? I think I understood what you were saying, but I'd appreciate it if you'd say it again. Yeah. I heard you saying you're in favor of retaining this word. Just say it again, what your reasons are.
Well, I think that in these terms, the third note of the creed, which is covered by Catholic or by Soborny, that element of the creed covers a variety of things. It includes the idea that we are one in the truth, and I think that is important. And I think it's a great pity that we tend to have allowed the word Catholic to be sort of drift off to the Roman Catholics. That it's a mark of the church itself. It's not a denominational designation. Conciliarity is bound up with that because historically the way the church has discerned the truth has been through councils. Certainly the ecumenical councils are primarily guided by this. And so you've got these two aspects. And Thomas said, well, what else is there? And it's occurred to me, it occurred to me as I was trying to think through my gut reaction to what Thomas said, is that the other element that needs to be included in this third note to the creed is what it is that binds the church together. There's a phrase, forgive me, I'm a pastor, I quite often use when I'm talking to people about prayer in sermons, and I say prayer is the sinews of the church. If they're arthritic, they won't do any good. They have to be practiced and used. We have to exercise them. Not because the church can only respond to the world in which it lives and fulfill the vocation that it has to proclaim Christ, if the sinews of the church are in fact in good order. That the church is not just one because because it signs up for the same creed, or not one because it has a conciliar tradition, but one because in some organic way. The thing that I think that in a way that Sobornost was always wanting to get at, but I think this is the way that I would want to put my finger on it. It's the idea that the church is bound together by prayer in Christ. And this is the thing that is in danger of slipping away if one thinks of what is meant by Sobornost is conciliarity.
Thank you, Father Andrew. I appreciate very much your understanding of Sobornost as a something practical and some kind of spiritual practice in first hand. Yes. Somebody would like to ask any questions, or we will move to our finish. And I would like to give a word, final word to Irina.
Thank you, Father Andrew. Thank you, everybody, for listening and engaging with this, in my view, very important presentation. And I believe that this is only the beginning. Well, so we would like to continue. And I'm very happy that we are still open to the notion of Sobornost, so we don't discard it yet. So maybe we'll give it a go and try to see, what else aspects it touches. And just one little remark, if I may, because we have also our colleagues from Finland and in Estonia as well. There is a tradition of congregational singing, and I've noticed that the notion of conciliarity and sobornost is very much used to characterize the congregational singing within the Orthodox Church. So, and of course, the congregational singing is a form of prayer. So I think this is a historical practice that is very, very important for this region in the Orthodox Church, and it is understood as a practice of sobornost. So this is something, to bring us to the point that has been emphasized several times. So thank you very much, and we would like to keep you informed about the future seminars, and I will send the recording.
Please do. I very much.
Yes. So let's all stay healthy and in good spirits.